Just to go back a little bit, I situated the text formally first, and you probably have diagrams, from this that I put on the board between the care, self, and world, and how this works in some ways that we're reading Being in Time on multiple levels. Certainly the level internally as a kind of formal rewriting of the history of ontology, the positive destruction of the history of ontology, and as a philosophy of subjectivity and of the subject. And I add the subject in there as well because of its enormous influence on Foucault and also a lot of theories of the subject, even on Badiou. You can see many levels to this, right? So I added this in the formal sense, but some of you who were present at the LIU, meeting, I tried to talk about this in terms of misreadings of the text after, it came out, particularly Husserl, who claimed it was, a philosophical anthropology, and not really ultimately philosophy or phenomenology. And then Sartre, of course, who Heidegger criticized later in 1947 as being a humanistic reading of Being in Time, and that really wasn't where he was going. I mean, one, again, possible misreading and misinterpretation. This was the historical, about its reception. Even up to today, the first generation of Jacques Derrida and the circle around Teleological especially were tremendously influenced by Heidegger. In fact, Derrida in his interviews with Guy Rossolto in Positions, a 1971 collection of interviews, says, we have not even begun to exhaust the critical resources of Heidegger, right, and even hermeneutics. And, he has an ongoing battle with hermeneutics, Derrida, and we can, ultimately talk about that too. But let's get down to hermeneutics as well.
My lips are sealed.
Oh, good, Chris. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Good. All right. So then, I spoke to it as retrieval. It's a Wiederholung, which I think is a very crucial term. Again, I know I put it up on this board multiple times, but a very crucial term to understand as a hauling along, a repetition, but really a retrieve. So what we're trying to do is retrieve through Heidegger, or with Heidegger, if you will, thinking with Heidegger, this ontological moment, right, if you will, in ancient philosophy that has been sort of displaced by the tradition. But in order to get there, we must actively work through the tradition in order to retrieve it. So this is happening. Recapitulation, how do we tell, the difference, how do we begin to recapitulate that? And repetition, and I added a repetition as in working through a neurosis. This is just a little bit of, play on the outside there. But really what you're doing is you're working through something, repeating, remembering, and working through to the point of where, it becomes part of your own appropriation. Because, as Stanley mentioned in the last class, it's about how you appropriate things, right, is really what pedagogy ultimately is about, and what you gain from a classroom and an education is really about, in my vision as well, is it's always the politics of appropriation, how you take something else up, how do you make it your own, how do you make it proper to you. This is also a Heideggerian thing. How does it become an authentic part of you, and most of us try to do this through writing or creation in the art, in arts, music, painting, etc., designing. Well, we have many levels of, practice here in some ways, and, hopefully, not only the note-taking, but it leads to more and more productive things. So anyway, this is, again, Being in Time functions on these levels, right? It functions always on this level. Then the next thing was the aporia, that we're facing this aporia. And aporia literally means the impasse, the difficult of passing or passing through. In the rhetorical tradition, it's being in doubt or skepticism, and to be at a loss. And I added for Derrida An aporia is the point of undecidability. Gödel, that you brought up last week, Sean brought up last week, the point of undecidability or the incompleteness, incommensurability, which locates the site at which the text must obviously undermine its own rhetorical structures. Excuse me, and it dismantles or deconstructs itself. So this is what happens in an aporia, where you reach for Derrida, right? Yeah, we could look at this through the lens of the strong reasons that maintain the threshold where systematic philosophy is no longer and not yet possible, right? Okay? So no longer do we have the great system builders, and to go back to a maxim of Nietzsche, I distrust all system builders in philosophy, even though you can systematize Nietzsche's thought around, as Heidegger did, through two central concepts, eternal recurrence of the same and the will to power.
It's kind of an incredible system.
Right, some kind of system there, right, etc. Okay, so the announced task by Heidegger, and this is in the text, is ultimately the one task, and this is a very interesting point, if you will, from the margins, to use Derridian language again, to provide a counterpart to Plato and Aristotle. But certain blind alleys were created that it did not really be overcome, and we'll try to discuss those as we go forward, right? Obviously this text, being in time, is presupposing, and I'm not saying, we can't read it, that's not the issue. The issue is it's deepened by a reading of Aristotle's Physics, particularly the fourth book on time. It's deepened by a reading of the Platonic dialogue on the Sophist, right, in its entirety. Since what I mentioned last week with the epigraph from the Sophist is a long meditation. This whole book is a meditation on this question of being and how we've forgotten it and what is its meaning and how do we retrieve it, etc. Right? So there are many pretexts that are operative here, including the Aquinian system, as some of you probably saw the reference to St. Thomas Aquinas and the ens creatum, in this thing, medieval theology. Obviously, the Cartesian moment, Descartes, and the drive for certainty in modern science, which is built upon the Cartesian system as modern science, etc. So anyway, once again, to think this through by, how does Heidegger maybe overcome some of this, right, in terms of the Aristotelian notion of time, which you'll again see, I'll mention again, this section 82 footnote on page 410. It's a very important note in terms of how time as the horizon is constituted and what the tradition is. It's a long footnote, page 410. Right? And anyway, all right, so what I did is I tried to divide the text into three thematic, movements, right, as real movements, right, in terms of the text. And the first movement is what we're going to start to engage, after finishing the introduction and the outline of the thesis, beginning in the section on Dasein, right, and Dasein is the exemplary being. It is only through Dasein that we can retrieve being, right? It is only through human beingness, but really Dasein again, and I want to point out, for me, Dasein may be, for our purposes, better translated as, orientation. Without the, how are we oriented, particularly, what ultimately is a subject position in this orientation? How do we have a position as a subject, our own subjectivity? And this would include phenomenology, etc. So anyway, the idea of fundamental ontology we dealt with last week a little bit, as opposed to metaphysics, right? What is this fundamental ontology that he's trying to get to? We spoke about this in relation to the disciplines, how regional ontologies and ontic modifications happen in disciplines, but what we're lacking is a fundamental ontology at the base. So unlike Descartes, who wants to build, a new foundation for the sciences in the 17th century, during the period of early, high rationalism, if you will, Heidegger wants to retrieve what he calls fundamental ontology because he sees the metaphysical destiny, or the destiny of Western metaphysics, leading to nihilism. right? Leading on the one hand to Hegel's logic, with all due respect, Arto, to Hegel's logic, right, on the one hand, and absolute knowing, right? This is one direction from Plato to Hegel, and the other was Plato to Nietzsche, that Western metaphysics ends up at the nihilistic point. And we have that most uncanny of guests knocking at our door, which again begins this whole dialogue, if you will, of nihilism during Weimar Germany in particular, and in France. Nihilism is a very active, we don't really speak of nihilism in the United States in the transcendental tradition or in the pragmatic. We just say, don't worry, be happy, right? Right? We don't really, engage that nihilistic thing, But anyway, this was a major talk, and you can go back politically, as many of you know, to the Russian nihilist movements, right, and many nihilist movements around anarchy and other, political movements of the 19th century. Yes. But nihilism, Dostoevsky, of course, being one good example of that, right? Yeah. And the underground man being a nihilistic anti-hero. I'm a sick man, I'm a spiteful man, I'm a resentful man. They say my liver's diseased. It's not that I don't respect doctors, but, I don't go, right? And where the famous thing, if I say 2 + 2 = 5, it's because I will it. He goes against reason. It's a wonderful text in this sense that, it's a kind of the schizoid hero, and at the same time the divided self, well before this becomes common language to psychoanalysis, and the Dostoevsky's underground man is already living through these things, and Okay, so anyway, so fundamental ontology versus that of metaphysics, even though we have not really overcome metaphysics, so therefore we have to again retrieve the tradition and work through it, right? Including readings of Aristotle's metaphysics. Yeah. No.
Do you think that Heidegger considered metaphysics to be just as relevant as the ontic sciences that he describes, the psychology and
anthropology? Oh, absolutely.
So it's not purely misleading.
No.
It's useful, but only after the foundation.
In fact, I don't think, and some people, I think Josh and Arto have read Introduction to Metaphysics, that Heidegger believes he's overcome metaphysics. I think he's, again, trying to, retrieve it, look at the problems in there, and one of the problems, as you guys know, is the framing of being and becoming, between permanence and change, between Parmenides and Heraclitus is a fundamental turn in Western philosophy. And then how the logos, how reason happens after this, and again, this is why, I guess, Husserl said philosophy is an infinite task. The reading here would be, you'd have to read the poem and study that of Parmenides, which is the first treatise on logical contradiction. Of course, the Heraclitus fragments, on being and becoming, locate, what the scholars do, they're looking back at the Greek words, how does toon, from which ontology comes, plays out in these multiple texts. When is it used? How many times does it repeat itself? Into what context? All of these things. So, that's one aspect of this. But yes, I don't really think the metaphysical questions to him remain. Why is there something rather than nothing, which really comes from Leibniz, who frames this, right? Right? Want to say something?
That's the opening of the
lecture. The opening of
Why is there something?
Yeah, it's a beautifully written text, and it's lectures he gives. And this is the book in which he says, to go back to this political controversy, to put it mildly, where he says, National Socialism is the movement of which this encounter with planetary technology will take place. But then in the same sentence, he talks about, in the same breath, right? He says, but this movement that parades around like National Socialism, this is 1935, is not really the real National Socialism. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, he's got that double edge always that's going on vis-a-vis Third Reich leadership. So, put it that way, leadership, right? The Fuhrer has beautiful hands. He said, he did say that. And Derrida very comedically and very cleverly wrote a piece called Heidegger's Hand.
I brought that up at school. They got very uncomfortable.
They did? And what you mean among faculty?
They got very uncomfortable.
Oh, good. That's good.
They weren't
it's
sure
good
if I
to
was
make
being
them
a Nazi
screaming.
or-
They weren't sure about that.
Beautiful hands.
Yeah, so
How can
beautiful
anything
hands.
beautiful be associated with Hitler?
Yeah, well, I mean, all you have to do is look at Leni Riefenstahl, and just watch that movie carefully. I'm sure most of you have seen The Triumph of the Will. And they understood the use of montage and the use of cinema as well as the Soviets did. You begin to see this battle of cinema working through The Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl.
And also the Olympic Games.
Who lived to be 103.
I know.
Swimming in the Caribbean at 100.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, she loved the Caribbean. She liked the brothers and. I'm sorry, it's true.
No, she said it.
She said it. She hasn't admitted it. Yeah, I'm not making this up. I could make it up, but I'm not. Given our circumstances out here now, I'm sorry.
Lectures in metaphysics.
Yeah. Introduction to metaphysics. There was a course. You have to remember, again, in Heidegger's case, this is the only published book. Right? Everything else is lectures. So you get a tome like this just on the sophist. Right? His lectures. So these people, unlike we, scattered professors today, he would write out book-length lectures for all of the courses. So the Introduction to Metaphysics, probably about 180, 200 pages, introducing it, a good 50,000, 60,000 words at least, right? Yeah. So he's writing this out as a lecture course. The contributions to philosophy. The Nietzsche, the meditations on Nietzsche are all lecture courses. The Will to Power is Art, the concept of the eternal recurrence of the same. God is Dead, which I think is a seminal essay still for him, a seminal interpretation of Nietzsche's word, God is Dead, which is a very long meditation on the joyful wisdom. With the madman. It's in the volume. I forgot which one. It's in the third German volume. I'm not sure which one in the English. Yeah, but I think I can get it. I mean, it's very very powerful work, because this is what the nihilism at the door in a certain way. And when Heidegger, and this was one good thing that was said in this film. That you gave me only a God. It's only a God. It's not God can save us now. Only a God. So that was carefully languaged by Heidegger when he did this interview, 1966 in Der Spiegel, which was first published, by the way, by the New School Philosophy Department's journal, graduate faculty of the journal, if you want to access this. And I don't know, I could probably make a copy. I find that there are very many good thoughts in there. He talks about translation machines. He talks about almost everything that we're doing today, that this is the age of cybernetics. So he's taking his point of departure again from his work on technology and this encounter. Because you have to, again, I want to emphasize the 1920s and the 30s were really about this encounter with what they call planetary technology. And this is Junger and Heidegger in particular. And they were looking for a political system that would be able to, best fulfill this. And, so this is where the thought really was going into the future. So, and he does this etymology. I again recommend reading The Question Concerning Technology. He asks again, what does it mean to question? No longer do we question being, but we're going to question what is technology. And he has a very, elaborate section about reserve stock. Every time you see jets going over you, or air exercises by the military, you begin to start thinking reserve stock, nuclear silos. He's very good at this. He really understands, in my opinion, for being this peasant with a walking cane in the Black Forest, that he is incredibly astute on militarism and the military, complex that is governing the world, right? As well as multinational capitalism. He doesn't use that language, like we use it, or global capitalism, but he's very well aware of these kind of things. Well, again, I'm not trying to justify it. Yeah.
And prescient as well, was it his idea that humans themselves would become fungible resources? Or was that somebody else who interpreted him? In other words, the idea we have these departments now.
Well, he never said anything like that. I mean, his most egregious comment, in my opinion, was he told Marcuse that the agricultural combines, the big agricultural combines, in terms of destroying the land, were just as vicious, or if not even more terrible, than the camps. So that ended that relationship, that exchange of letters. That was 1948. And you know, Aletheia, full disclosure about, you know, Heidegger's, you know, some of the things he did say. Yeah.
Right.
But, you know, if you think about it from his perspective, you know, in some ways he is...
Anti-speciesist environmentalism.
Right, yeah. The environmentalists take this up right away and say, look what Monsanto's doing. Yeah, and he's so wrong. I mean, you know, you have genocide
Monsanto than you can with a camp.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, there's a way of, you know, becoming very sophistic about that, being a master rhetorician to take up that kind of language. So, yeah. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, one of the points. But anyway, to go back to this, you know, and so going forward, again, I mean, what I'd like us to do, I mean, we probably have 10, 11 weeks, I don't know how many weeks we have left, but at least 10, right? Or 11.
Who's counting?
But anyway, who's counting? We're not counting. All right, fair enough. Yeah. And we're going to go to LIU. We'll go to LIU for two times in December and 2 times in January, so we'll have the nice seminar room, I hope, with a blackboard and all this again.
Is this a reaction to Peter's comment that seminars should be 6 weeks? Now you're saying...
Oh, yeah. It's like Aristotle. You have the poverty over here, the wealth here, and, you know, we're trying to come to some compromise, but it ain't happening. So the extreme grows, right? Yeah. Anyway, so anyway, I'm doing that. So anyway, we went through the prejudices about being last week. Yeah. What I've done, and the pre-understanding, and we'll talk about the point of departure to do, and then what is questioning. We went through that. What is asked, right? The meaning. We have spoken to the German word Sinn as both meaning, directionality, and a sense of. And when people say in philosophy, I have a sense of, or in the Humean sense, they mean the direction and the meaning of a concept, right?
Well, also
or of a proper name. Well, yeah, please.
Cartography
in any kind of a field. Okay.
I was going to ask you if you meant that about design meaning orientation or position. Would you say sense or Sinn in there too?
Not in its first determination, maybe in its second determination. Again, just the orientation. Where is the position, you know, the subject position, and then you would begin to talk about directionality and meaning.
Okay.
For me, you know, at least to my mind, you know, what he's doing. Okay?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So then, today, you know, we'll talk about Transcendental Phenomenology, which is a term of Husserl. Althusser once said, as a good communist, he told Tran Vác Tho, the Vietnamese philosopher, phenomenology and dialectical materialism, he said, we are all transcendental egos, which meant that we have reflected and reflected and reflected to the last, you know, levels of being, you know, transcendental egos, you know, which means you've reflected on almost everything you could possibly reflect upon, and in that process, right? Which is an extension, of course, of Cartesian reflection, you know, of the subject-object, you know, dichotomy that took place in the 17th century. All right, so we have fundamental ontology as hermeneutical phenomenology. So I've drawn up a little I'll put it on the board of what the verb hermeneutics really means. I've got 7 definitions and several usages in the ancient Greek world. You know, so you understand that hermeneutics just does not mean, you know, it's just you're interpreting or you're enclosed in a circle around certain premises and conclusions. It's much more elaborate than that. Transcendentalism as, you know, part of the Husserlian moment, and then working out the method and we'll speak to this today. Most of you probably read, and I think you liked it, right, on the concept of phenomena, the concept of logos. You know, all of this is very important for Heidegger. And again, I mentioned once again, this section he wants to retain as meaningful, right? Whereas the rest, the existential analytic, he tried to push away. He tried to push away the philosophy of the subject, to push away subjectivity, I think later on. Yeah. So in some senses, we're retrieving the existential analytic. Part of our purpose here, since we're all, half crazed, opiatic, messes in the dysgenic society, we're trying to retrieve, a very powerful part of this that he, by the after the World War II was over, sort of was looking at. No, I don't really think I worked it out adequately there. Yeah, so we'll see. Okay. So then the second movement, and we'll probably get to this in maybe another 2 weeks on page 2, is the general understandings. I call this generalities. Generalities 1, first of all, the being in the world. What does it mean to be in a world? Yeah. What does it mean to be in a world? And in being in the world as attunement, and you have the diagram, right? Attunement and understanding and speech, all being part of, you're attuned in a specific world. Determination could be another word. It's Befindlichkeit, right? And Bestimmung together. I'm looking at here how one is attuned and engaged in a world determined. How do you understand that attunement, right? And then speech. So if you're Cecil Taylor, a Thelonious Monk, you've got some kind of being in the world here in terms of your attunements, your understanding, and then your practice. Even though it's going to.
Why speech?
Because he's going to have a whole section on speech, the speaking subject, which is part of the hermeneutic. Aristotle defines us not only as a political animal, but an animal that has reason. We possess reason. So our being has reason, has the ability to speak reason.
Is that conflated with logos?
Yes, well, logos is part of that. Yeah, you have a legein and a logo. Unfortunately, I don't have all the etymology down to the ancient Greek, but, to the philologist or to the classicist here, this plays out well because your legein is the verb tense of logos, right? To speak, to speak the reason or the account of something. So we're beginning to see, we see how he is taking both philosophy of language, particularly against the early Wittgenstein. He doesn't use him as an antagonist, but he has his antagonist hidden here, right? That he wants to speak about speech in terms of being in the world, right? Not just separate from it as a pure philosophy of language. So you're always situated. You're always situated, if you will.
Privileging speech.
Well, you're being very Derridian on me now, Chris. I
I didn't use his name.
Yeah, I know you didn't, but I understand where the questions being thrown out here, where it's coming from.
But it's anyway, it's discourse that he specifically.
Yes, he's going to go to discourse. He's going to go, and if you remember, I put these words on the board earlier: conversation or read it, speech, REDE. Yep.
He says apophantic speech.
And Sprach, as you say, do you speak German? Sprache, is also another term he'll use in the German. And I'll cross. I have the book in German. I can't get through it, but but it's a very austere. Oh man, this is so typical American candy. Come in, the German. I'll bring in the German next week. You talk about black forest. Yeah, right. Anyway, okay. So the next category after being in the world, right, is care, Zorga. And if you remember, I put up multiple categories of Zorga. The Zorga that is the call of conscience, care, then the taking care of, and then the concern. So you should have this in your notes. I remember doing this. There's no need for me to go back You know, if you'd like, I can send you, you know, I mean, a little bit of this, right? So first of all, we have the heuristic function of angst, of anxiety, which, you know, most people are translating dread vis-a-vis Kierkegaard. Some have now translated the concept of dread, the concept of anxiety. And Kierkegaard is very influential on Heidegger. He doesn't really speak about it much, but obviously he had read much of Soren Kierkegaard, who, I mean, I don't know, I mean, I can do this really quickly, you know, since...
The heuristic value is what we learn from dread.
Yes, what we learn and what research paradigm we can build. Double sense, yes. Learning, right, heuristics, right, as well as how do we set up a research, you know, yeah. Because where he's really going is towards ontological research here. Yeah, ultimately, yeah. Not only just the rewriting of the history of ontology, but how do we do, you know, begin to guide research. I mean, I know I spoke to this a little bit. How do you build a project of understanding cancer differently and going about problematizing it differently, you know, based on this kind of, or disease in general, or in society. So anyway, let me just do this quickly. So, you know, as most of you know, Hegel, you know, culminates in the phenomenology of mind in 1807, and of course there's the left Hegelians, right, which include, you know, everybody from Bruno Bauer. I'm not going to go through all of these, but anyway, Max Stirner, The Ego in Its Own. You know, just some of the proper names. Marx encounters both of these in the second and third sections of the German ideology, right? And then this leads into, of course, as you know, Marx, you know, takes this up and goes well beyond, right? I mean, obviously influenced by both the phenomenology and the logic, but if you date this by the phenomenology, etc. So this was the material, you know, first of all, left idealism. What was Marx's? Moses Hess, Arnold Ruge. These are some of the people that are all part of that moment of Hegel. On the other side of this, you know, on the right wing, you have Kierkegaard, right? And Kierkegaard's main claim against Hegel figured everything else out, but he left out man. Right? He figured everything out, but he left out subjectivity. So this became a kind of cry in philosophy to return to subjectivity. So you have this left movement, you know, the materialistic movement of Marx against, you know, the topsy-turvy world. I'm going to stand Hegel back on his head, right? I mean, on his feet. He's on his head. You know, the old materialism, idealism thing. It's much more complicated, but just for general purposes. But the Kierkegaard, you know, begins to say, well, yes, this is all fine and beautiful, beautiful system of philosophy and absolute knowing, you know, and it unfolds perfectly, logically, etc. But he leaves out one thing, subjectivity. Truth, ultimately, is subjectivity. Right? So he comes up with this proposition. So from here, you begin to see a real interest, not only among theologians, right, but among, you know, philosophers in Germany, particularly in the 1910s and 20s, right, begin to turn to Kierkegaard to reread him. So the concept of anxiety becomes crucial, right? We are anxious, and, you know, Kierkegaard has 3 stages on life's way. And this is important, I guess, if you treat, if you're a therapist. It's not a bad way of looking at life in some ways. The first is you're the aesthetic man. The aesthetic man, and he uses man, I mean, you could say aesthetic human or aesthetic design if you want, or aesthetic subject, is the one who is full of possibility, right? So the possibilities are all there, the aesthetic. That the next stage is the ethical, the one who has made the choice to do, you know, one thing, right? Has made that choice among the possibilities. So that's the second stage he talks about. But the final stage is what he calls the moral. And the moral stage is what he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. And he uses this phrase to refer to Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, or potential sacrifice of Isaac. That Abraham, as the first territorial representative of the Old Testament, I read Abraham that way, he's an expansionist. Right? Territorial, right? Very much. Just think of his relationships with Sarah and his other, and Sarah couldn't give him children. You know the story. But anyway, Abraham, according to Kierkegaard, makes this leap of faith through God's voice, right? That you must make this sacrifice to demonstrate your faith to me. So Abraham, nobody is ethical if they would kill their firstborn son, right? But he makes a moral choice, right? Which is related to the transcendent at that time, that kind of thing, right? So this becomes somewhat part of subjectivity in terms of the old faith knowledge dichotomy that takes place in the Enlightenment. You know this, right? That the Enlightenment, and I'll give you a little story about this, a Zizek story. Faith is, overcome by knowledge in the Enlightenment. Reason is really, the Enlightenment's way of overcoming, medieval faith, etc. It's beginning of the destruction of, religion, its secularization and work. Zizek says the problem with the fundamentalists is that they believe faith is knowledge. There's no dichotomy. There's no tension between the two, and I think he's very right about that. They think if you believe, you have knowledge, and that's it. That's all you need is this dogma going forward. Yeah, and maybe we could take this proposition again to the alt-right and understand them in this kind of the whole thing of fake news and everything. There's lots you can do with this in a certain way, this kind of proposition. But to go back to this, obviously Heidegger is reading Kierkegaard. This is again a figure who's trying to think through. And I forgot to mention this to you. I know I've mentioned it here before, but I don't think this time around, is that Heidegger studied very actively a book that was always on his desk, was on the manifold senses of the word being by Franz Brentano. Yep, on the manifold senses of the word being by Franz Brentano. Brentano is an interesting character, philosopher and psychologist, of whom many people attended the lectures, including Freud and Husserl. Heidegger never was too young to attend the lectures, but he read this book and studied it on the manifold senses, or in some cases translated on several senses of the word being. And this was a reading of Aristotle. Brentano, like the old bookseller, Yeah. Franz, right?
Is he German?
Yes, of course. They're all German.
Franz. His name's Franz.
Franz. Is Fritz home? Where's Martin? Anyway, going back to this. Yeah, you're getting started anyway. Anyway, so Brentano becomes very, very prevalent, again, like he's studying this all. And this may be, if you will, the kind of inspiration for the book. It wasn't Hannah Arendt, as they said in the movies. That she was the muse for being in God. Right, yeah, anyway. I'm not saying it's a book that did it either. It may have been Elfrida, his wife, or another, Fraulein, but who knows? I don't know what really inspired. I'm not there talking to him, and, etc. But this was certainly a fundamental text in the development of being in time. Okay? The thing is, Husserl was there, and Husserl is taking out of this, right, a lot of his methodology in terms of trying to make philosophy into a science, right? Vis-a-vis, as a rigorous science. Again, a science of phenomena. This is what phenomenology does. It's the study of experience and our consciousness of that experience, which is what philosophy had gotten very far away from. And, again, speaking to today, and so I think Stiegler is very good at this, in terms of his book, The Critique for a New Critique of Political Economy, where he talks about a category called primordial narcissism, which is not primary narcissism in the Freudian sense, but a primordial narcissism is where there's auto-affection, love of self, and that we don't really have that experiential level anymore inside of ourselves because of all the overcoding, the overwhelmingness of information, and living in this cybernetic age. That we're blocked in a way, access to experience. Like Heidegger says, we're blocked to being. We maybe have lost access to real experience, or at least deep experience. So Husserl wants to, again, 100 years ago, go back to what he would call philosophy as a science of studying the phenomena, of lived experience. This became the word, lived experience, which Sartre takes up as well, the lived experience of the subject. So the experiential becomes very much a part of this, unlike in the Marxist tradition, to go back to this very simple, simplistic diagram up here. This becomes something that the Marxist tradition never really talked about. Only alienation, and in the context of nature, spirit, labor, right, and others, right, but not the experiential in a different way, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting moment, right? And it came back to, quote unquote, the question of subjectivity, or the question of, the way we call it, the individual, etc. Yeah. So in other words, Hegel has universalized everything so much into the universalization of, that he goes through in his logic, right, which is an attempt to build a new set of universals, right, and he's done this, and somehow he's left out the subject, right, ultimately. Objective reason, objectivating reason, these kind of categories ultimately are part of, exclusion of subjectivity. So again, Heidegger is going to come back around, going back to this concept of anxiety, to try to put Dasein as this both interrogator that we're going to work through, transparent in its being, but at the same time, that which experiences anxiety. Right? And the object of anxiety, Angst in German, is nothing. Fear has an object. You can deal with fear. You have a fear of, poisonous snakes, you can deal with it. You stay away, you avoid, anyway. But the Angst is something that we never really can identify. Right? We don't really put our finger on what's making us so anxious, right? And that's because of the yes, exactly. So he's going to build, another kind of, moment here vis-a-vis care based on angst. Okay, so then the wholeness of the subject in terms of this care, and we'll get to this when we read the section on Zorga. There's a whole section on this differentiation and how it becomes fragmented. And then the two types of selves, the self or the subject that is being in a world, and then the self and being within a world, with a world, with others, right? Which he never fleshes out. That's another thing, a big criticism of Heidegger that Sartre, as I mentioned earlier, took up, is that he never fleshed out the Mitsein, the being with others. Okay? Then we go on to time, temporality, right? And not in terms of the footnote yet, but it's an earlier horizon for him. The heuristic function of what Chris mentioned, being towards death. We are thrown into a world where we are being towards death. This was articulated by Hannah Arendt as a twofold movement, natality, mortality. And she always tried to think within those two moments. Yeah, natality, being born, right, and immortality. And again, as most of you know, there's a whole slew of books that came out on this, The Denial of Death by Becker. You have many, many books that, talked about how in the United States, in particularly in the advanced worlds, how much is covered over by this denial of our own mortality. And consumerism comes out of that. I mean, we're always have to fill ourselves because of this very deep-seated demand that we no longer will be, right? etc. So he's trying to look at this as another kind of, heuristic function, if you will, or whatever, and how you totalize around this being towards death into, right, a temporality. And this is when you begin to experience yourself as a subject, as past, right, the present, which is never really always present on a line, and a leap into the future. So Heidegger is really talking about these three ecstasies of time, where maybe the retention of the memory system is projected so far, protension, right, into the future, that it produces a new kind of ecstasies where we stand outside of ourselves. We're no longer enclosed subjects. We begin to emerge outside, right? And that's what really, to be ecstatic, really means to come out of the stasis, come out of the war. Stasis means civil war, literally, in Greek, And if you're static versus dynamic, dynamics is interesting as an oppositional term dialectically, that you begin to see, action as overcoming civil war. Dynamis, right? In some ways, it's kind of interesting. I mean, at least etymologically, I'm not saying it always works that way out in all contexts, but at least in the beginning, in this kind of oppositional thing. So you begin to experience this thing, and then, this ecstatic temporality that you're going through, past, present, and future, this experience becomes the condition for history, or what he will call historicality, against histoire in the French, just telling stories or telling narratives. It's more about those ecstasies, in terms of the writing of history, moments, and this leads ultimately, he doesn't use this language so much in this, but to the Ereignis, the event of appropriation, and also what he says about being as an occurrence. Right? It's a happening. It's something happening. Right? Like Bob Dylan, in a way, it's interesting how much this plays out in popular culture. There's something happening in here, and you don't know what it is. Do you, Mr. Jones? Right? I'm serious. You're laughing, but I mean, there's a lot of seriousness in this popular culture, right? Yeah. Or what's happening used to be a thing. Today it's what's cooking. Right? No, I don't know. part of our Reagan Revolution regression. What's cooking? They deliver the food. I'm sorry. Only Rachel and I on occasion.
What's up?
Yeah?
What's up?
What's up?
Weird, actually.
What's up?
Yeah.
Is that all they say?
Yeah.
What's up? What's up?
What up?
Okay. What up? What up? Okay. All right. Well, yeah.
You're not going to break that down?
No, I don't want to. I'm sorry. Thank you. Good try. Yeah. Good try. That horizon upness isn't part of the verticality of this movement. He's a horizonal thinker. His temporality is horizonal. It's not vertical up and down.
Two-dimensional plane.
It's a two-dimensional plane. See, they've regressed to two-dimensional space. City of God, right? Heaven and hell. Yeah, in Euclidean terms. Yes, good. So anyway, we'll look at that. We'll again, looking at this as a quote, for lack of a better term, a founding text, if you will, at least in, the rewriting of the history of both philosophy and ontology, right? So third movement will be the ontic modifications, and this is when we'll be getting into totality and structure, and I want to use these words, interchangeably and also as much dialectically as possible. Inauthentic totalization, how one's being towards death is a neurotic or an inauthentic response to one's mortality, and this becomes part of a kind of inauthentic totalization. One does not really live to one's projects. One does not literally live to one's... He uses sometimes language like destiny, but this is very Greek, that you're not living to, quote, your full, realization of your thing. You had a question?
No.
Okay. Yeah. And then the other one was authentic totalization, of where this encounter is productive, and this encounter with your being towards death, is an authentic one, right? And you begin to, see the whole, you begin to see a different kind of, horizon, if you will, right? There's a new level of horizon. And then you have this in the thrownness, how you get to inauthentic projection, which is 95% of the culture. I was told by a friend I should never have put politics of inauthenticity on the thing, but I'll stick by that. I mean, I'm not so sure it's Heidegger, but I think we should discuss this in a class where this language of authenticity and inauthenticity is being used, because inauthentic projection is rampant. We see this all the time. I mean, this is where this, falling prey to, a dictogenic society, falling prey to fake news, to no news, to journalism all the time, to the storytelling, to all of these kind of things are partially due to, this inauthentic projection in one's throne. So I'm not saying we're building authentic Nazi soldiers here. Please don't hear it this way. It's a question of where we can use this kind of conceptualization for today's world. What becomes proper to one's own, that's really what authentic means. An Eigenlichkeit, taking what is proper to one's own, what belongs to oneself, right? In a way. And so he's speaking on this kind of level as well. So then I would like to, we come kind of later in some, there'll obviously be a lot of, marginal effects from this, in terms of the influences. And as I mentioned, this text of 1927 is tremendously, influential, to put it mildly, right, on some Marxists, certainly the psychoanalysts, the design analysis, schools, obviously French philosophy enormously after World War II, right, in some ways. A kind of cult in Germany more than, the universities, because he was not really that present and after the denazification period, right, although he was given an emeritus status, at the University of Freiburg. Yeah, that's right. And, he had a lot of muscle around him, to put it mildly. I mean, there were a lot of people that were extremely supportive. And then, I was going to talk at the end, again, about knowledge, his critique of epistemology. It's not only metaphysics, which is an antagonistic tension. It's also the question of how do we come and what is the conditions for the possibility of how we know something. How is knowledge produced, etc. And then practice, what kind of practices does this lead to? And I use that word in kind of the Foucaultian sense of a micro practices in a way, but we can use it more in terms of Marxian praxis as well. So I want to think that through. And then the question of how do we act in the world? What are we really doing in terms of acting in the world? So that's where I would want to go. I put at the end here this section that I think, again, is crucial, and it's the note on being in time of Derrida, if you want to add. The sections 75 to 82, I want to read that as carefully as we're doing with 1 through 8 and following. 75 through 82 are the sections on time. It ends the treatise, right, in a way. Temporality as the horizon for being. And we'll engage the footnote, like I said, was one footnote on 410 is a crucial, or is a nodal point, if you will, for this. Yeah. Oh, okay, that's coming down. You're not raising your hand. You're throwing away that ugly painting. Yeah. Okay, so that's sort of the itinerary, as they like to say in Heideggerese. This is the itinerary of thought and itinerary of the reading and where we're going. And I want you to remember this. He thought, and again, people have criticized this, but he thought that basically the great thinking, that the path, the method, in a sense, that philosophy was really about errancy. You never really found answers, but it was the wanderings, and I use this metaphor of the wood path, that you would get really signs for this, in a sense. So it was never to really resolve everything, right? In a way, it was actually how does one make the journey, where are the wood paths along the way. And the great philosophy is a great mistake. That's where we really are. We're in the history of errancy. And for those of you who've read Twilight of the Isle of Nietzsche, history of an error, on the 4 points in the downfall from the Platonic idealism. Again, if philosophy is to be read by, like Whitehead said, as one long footnote to Plato, right? You begin to see, this errancy, the history of the era, beginning there in systematic philosophy. So this is where he's kind of going, in a way. So I hope this helps. I mean, I'm going to try to adhere to it as much as I can. What's that? I'm sorry?
Very helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And hopefully we'll. Yeah. David. Yeah. No problem. Yeah.
Could you define ontic and ontic-ontological?
Well, the ontic is basically your social world. It's the world that you're living in. It's beer with beings with a lower case. Dasein belongs to the ontic, but it is only through the ontic that we begin to interrogate being capitalized, or getting back to this question and meaning of being. Right? So the ontic is really like the social world, right? The being in is maybe can be part of an ontological, but it's also part of an ontic world as well as being with. So social relations, right? All of these things are part of ontic that can be modified. And if you remember the graph I made, the kind of little diagram here that I have handwritten out that's kind of illegible, but anyway, the existentials, the characteristics, and the everyday modifications are all on the ontic levels, right? Right? Yeah. So you're thrown into the world as an ontic, right? Right? But the question is, it's only through Dasein that you can really question, right? Going towards this, being, right? Which may be empty, which may be a fiction, may be the void itself. We don't, yeah.
For me, he was making a really...
Or silence in Beckett's sense, or in John Cage's sense, in a different way. Yeah, please.
For me, it was really etymologically just the fact that logos was missing. It was like ontic, and then ontological was...
Yes, the account of.
The discourse of, and the making, the bringing to light of the ontic. Right. So ontological is just like rationalizing the world.
Well, not rationalizing it, giving it an account. He doesn't have reason. Again, as I pointed out, I don't know if you were there the first session at LIU, but Heidegger does not have a category for reason.
Right.
This has been another criticism, that this is a complete anti-enlightenment, or an end around the Enlightenment, if you will. Yeah.
I thought in his description of logos, he spoke about with truth. Logos sort of brings us to reason. Like he sort of brought truth and logos together.
Again, I just want to be careful with the terms, because he never really talks about truth itself, except as a criticism, and you saw this today in the correspondence theory of truth and the traditional theories of truth. That's where truth is used. His notion of truth is aletheia, right? Which is disclosedness and disclosure, veiling and unveiling, all of these kind of, this is a movement, a dual movement, always happening in
our
investigation. So he's not going to use the true or the false. Right. This refers to logic, right? I mean, he's looking at those metaphysical. I know Artaud's looked a little bit at the metaphysical foundations of logic. He's looking at what's behind, quote, this logic, both of contradiction, true and false. So if you have Heidegger, for those of you in the Lefebvre class, reading Lefebvre, reading Hegel, you begin to see Heidegger's going to start looking at what are these presuppositions that he's using here, right? What is the metaphysical presuppositions or foundations of this logic? He's going to see Lefebvre and Hegel in that tradition, right? And up until probably the 1950s, when he had conversations, and I'm not sure, I'm starting to read about this in an active way. Kostas Axelos, who was a friend of his, the Greek philosopher, Marxist, they kind of turned him to read Marx seriously, Heidegger. Yeah. So
I guess I was saying truth.
So anyway,
truth in the Greek sense that he was talking about with aesthesis.
Yes, but the Greeks had multiple notions of truth too.
Right.
Yeah, that's another.
He likes the.
See, Plato's concept of the truth. He wrote a 250-page treatise just on Plato's concept of the truth, his doctrine, teaching of the truth, where he criticizes Plato's notion of the truth. So this becomes part of a counterpoint. I just want listen. I'm just trying to attune our minds to, if you will, to, the grandiosity, the ambition, and sometimes the real failings of this project,
He says we don't have the grammar for it.
He does talk about the lack of the grammar, and this is where Derrida comes in, and Nietzsche, who said, grammar is the police of our language. We have not killed God because we have not killed grammar. And this is interesting. I mean, in terms of another way of thinking about no longer divinity or the divine, but you're thinking of God as grammar. And why Derrida would write a book, De la Grammatologie.
The gram is different from the grammar. The
That's
grammar
correct.
is the trace.
Well, the gram is from the gramme in Greek.
But
it's the written trace.
The written trace.
Right.
It's not syntax.
Yes, that's correct. Well, grammar's different than syntax, right? You have grammar and syntax, right? They're combined. Grammar and syntax.
Yeah,
right?
but when.
Yeah.
All right, but.
Tell me what you're going to say.
No,
It's okay. I don't mean to.
De la Grammatologie and the gram is not grammar in the sense of policing the language. It's the trace, as you said, the writing.
Right. That's right.
Grammar is something else.
But writing has a grammar to it. Levi-Strauss has a grammar.
I don't
criticizes,
Was Derrida interested in grammar, though?
He's interested in Nietzsche, and he's interested in God and grammar.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, in
he's
terms
interested
of
in
communism.
Nietzsche.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
But
Anyway.
in the introduction to metaphysics,
please,
he does go through logos as truth, right? Or he goes through all the etymology of logos that we all just talked about, like different forms. And he says that that basically Christianity is done perverted the idea of logos.
Yes.
And and affected how we think about it today.
Right. Plato's doctrine of the truth. And the short story to this would be on the essence of reasons, or on the ground of reasons. It's poorly translated. I think it's on the grounds of reason, like the ground problems of phenomenology, which is translated as thing. So in here, in the essence of reason, right? He actually goes through a critique of the correspondence theory of truth, right?
Yeah.
And then he backs up, if you will, to Plato's doctrine of truth.
It's a very short section. It's not that long.
An introduction to metaphysics has this too as well. And remember that one thesis out there about Hölderlin, who is the, quote, supposedly poetic founder of Germania during the Romantic period, that Hölderlin actually goes mad because of translation. This is where the madness happens when he's translating this part of Antigone about what is man, what is anthropos, right? And this, So this becomes more and more interesting as you go deeper into it about what they're up to. Again, we're stupid. I mean, I hate to say it. We're just compared to this, revised ancient model that the Germans are taking up in the 1920s and the 30s in this educational background. It probably remained until the 60s, maybe early 70s to a degree. But really, this whole period of German Romanticism through Weimar, the destruction of a lot of this revised ancient model with the Third Reich, and then its return, comes back. I don't think it's an accident that Adorno goes back to Germany to teach. I mean, he could have lived a very comfortable life. He loves Sils Maria, and Switzerland. He loved, all these other, he loved Italy, etc. But he went and taught, in a sense. So there was something about recovering this German philosophical and scientific tradition that's very important. So when I say we don't really have this background from day one in the schools where philology, etymology, all these, subjects, not that all German students get this, but they actually had a culture that developed around this that allowed for this. I mean, you don't produce figures think of what's produced in Germany. Just on this kind of Kierkegaardian right out of Hegel, you have Jaspers, Arendt, Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, Ernst Junger. You can go down the list, right? On the left, Horkheimer, Adorno, Mannheim, Krakauer, etc. We're doing Dewey, here, right? Lippmann. Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, you know, who figures out I can screw America right royally, right? He develops the whole propaganda. You know the story, Ed Bernays, right? How he got women to smoke and all that. You know, I went to many psychoanalysts. They told me what the cigarette signified. You know, so I decided that there was a women's suffrage movement going on, right? And I thought about the Statue of Liberty, carrying the torch. So they would be smoking, women being liberated from the men saying they couldn't smoke by doing a march for voting rights and cigarettes. They would be smoking cigarettes. Then the market for cigarettes was open for women. Yeah, this is what he did. And he was right, you know. Yeah, you know, 50% of the women started smoking after that publicly.
As they should.
Yeah, all through the movie, yeah, right. All through the movie, exactly right. It'd be good. Virginia Slims. Well, that was a play. That was a play later on Bernays' Torches for Liberty. He has a whole thing staged on Fifth Avenue where they're smoking.
You've come a long way, baby.
You've come a long way, baby. It was the Virginia, and it wasn't Virginia Fats. It was Virginia Slims too. That was another thing very important in terms of the linguistic, you know, signifiers here, which are very material. People say this is ideal. Give me a break. You know, this is always material signification, right? How is it used?
I'm wondering about the Virginia, though.
So,
how did that
that's
get
where
there?
tobacco.
Well, where tobacco's grown.
Oh, I thought it was because it was also
No.
a woman's name.
Yeah.
So there's
Well,
some-
yeah, both.
Of
Of course,
So
both.
it's a double.
Philip Morris is
Yeah,
in-
always a double. Always a double. You should know that. Always a double.
Always a double.
Wasn't there a tennis tournament though that I think was held in?
Yeah, Virginia
Yeah,
Slims
but
sponsored
they
Virginia.
sponsored
Yeah,
it,
but no, but before that, yeah, right. The cigarette was named
Figured out how they got
before that
Before the tip.
for Virginia to smoke, but also that's where the tobacco was from.
Athleticism and, you know,
Yeah,
male-
yeah, yeah. Al Gore's family, tobacco farmers. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Also related to Gore Vidal. Yeah, yeah, tobacco farmers. North Carolina. Yeah. You didn't know that?
Al Gore and
Al Gore Vidal.
And Gore Vidal are first
related.
cousin, second cousin.
Really?
Yes.
Al
You can look it up, Google it.
Gore.
I don't make. I mean, you know, I have to do this because my
The name
students
thing is
always
Gore.
go. Professor, you were right. So you know that gets over with.
So it's Gore.
How you do
comma,
that,
Vidal.
Professor? You know, yeah. Gore Vidal. Yeah, he was given the family name as a first name. Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
His real first name is Eugene.
Eugene
father.
Gore. He didn't like Eugene.
No.
Not Gore. He liked Gore.
Like Gorian.
He liked Gorey and Gore. Yeah, right together. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So anyway, this, you know, again, I want to just say again, this is a, you know, an incredible intellectual, you know, renaissance and enterprise that's, you know, very overwhelming because we're still recovering somewhat from the 19th century, much less these upsurges in the 20th century. You know. Yeah. So this is very important. I mean, Marx is a thinker of the 19th century. He comes out of this model. He's out of the revised ancient model. This privilege of Greek and Latin, philosophy, literature, you know, philology, etymology. You know, these minds don't just are not born in bar rooms or good discussions about how alienated you feel at the mill on a given day. You know, I mean, yeah.
If only.
So yeah, if only. Yeah, if only. Yeah, you do that after work and you go learn. You know, like Stanley. Stanley's remarkable in the sense that he would work, you know, the long day, you know, and then he would go to the library and he would read. Yeah, yeah. And this is how he learned. You know, he went to the communist school, got kicked out of Brooklyn College, you know, for leading a student movement. Never went back to school, really. He went back to school to write a paper at the new school to get his BA. And then, you know, because he needed, quote, credentials, he went to this union graduate school, which is, you know, you basically write your, you know, dissertation through a 3-committee of your own choice, and they give you a degree. It's a way for, you know, people that are very self-starters who can't stand classrooms. Yeah. So that you know, that's how, you know, Aronowitz, you know, kind of grew up in terms of the world of ideas, right? In a sense. But yeah, but these people are the very, very strong tradition here. Yeah. And they had a free university in Berlin too, which Heidegger did never really, you know.
that the same as the...
It's the same one that's going on today. Yeah. It's still going on today. The big name there, and unfortunately, I mean, we should read him in the future alongside of alongside of Stiegler, Friedrich Kittler, who was a giant, in my opinion. A book called Discourse Networks, of which Derrida and Foucault and Lacan figure prominently. Another theory of the media and what the media has done in information technologies, and very influenced by Heidegger, like Stiegler. These are two of the major theories. Kittler. Friedrich. He just died about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and he's created a kind of school around him. There are a lot of, there are about 5 or 6, media. They do a lot of empirical work, especially on digital technologies and stuff like that. But anyway, okay, so I mean, I guess when I reread, I get overwhelmed too. So I'm kind of working through my anxiety on this. Yeah. So okay, so I'm gonna just do one thing on hermeneutics, and then we'll go back to the text if that's okay, right? So Heidegger will, speak about the hermeneutical, and I think the first time it's mentioned is in the outline of I think it's got the 4 senses, and page 25 he first mentions the word. I mean, maybe we should do this too. Maybe I should read this section and then I'll go to hermeneutics. If you look at the top of page 25, however, this Greek interpretation of being comes about without any explicit knowledge of the guideline functioning in it. And this is about the speaking subject, Chris. He's kind of following up on the again, right? Without taking cognizance of or understanding the fundamental ontological function of time, without insight into the ground of the possibility of this function. On the contrary, time itself is taken to be one being among others. So he's going to displace this. This is obviously where he's going to go, right? That the tradition has always thought of time as a being among others. Yeah, correct.
Right. So he's going to go undo that.
He's going to undo that.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that's where he's going to do this positive destruction.
That makes sense.
Right?
To get to what he's trying to do. Yeah.
Right. Okay? The attempt is made to grasp time itself in the structure of its being within the horizon of the understanding of being. Why did the general understanding of being and heuristic function of angst and all these kind of things, which is oriented toward times in an inexplicit and a naive way. Within the framework of the following fundamental elaboration of the question of being, a detailed temporal interpretation of the foundations of ancient ontology. So we're going to go first back to the temporal foundations, that is, in Aristotle, cannot be offered. We will not do this. Instead, we offer an interpretation. This is the beginning of the hermeneutics of Aristotle's treatise on time, and this is the book 4, as you see in the footnote, and the sections he's referring to in the physics, which can only be taken in a way of discerning the basis and the limits of the ancient science of being. Aristotle's treatise on time is the first detailed interpretation of this phenomenon that has come down to us. It essentially determined all the subsequent interpretations of time, including that of Bergson. From our analysis of Aristotle's concept of time, it becomes retrospectively clear that the Kantian interpretation moves within the structure that's developed by Aristotle. So he doesn't see an interruption in the Enlightenment with classical, Greek philosophy or ontology. It's interesting. He sees a continuity. This means that Kant's fundamental ontological orientation, despite all the differences implicit in a new inquiry, remains Greek. Right? Remains Greek. The question of being attains true concreteness only when we carry out the destruction. So you're mired in abstraction until this destruction is being carried out. Keep that in mind. This is really, as Marxists sometimes talk about, the movement of the abstract to the concrete. Heidegger is speaking about the movement from the phenomenological destruction, which is plowing away the abstractions in order to get to true concreteness, right? And this only happens in the destruction of the ontological tradition, right? By doing so, page 25, I'm sorry. By doing so, we can prove the inescapability of the meaning of being, and thus demonstrate what it means to talk about what it's a true retrieval. This word I keep making, retrieval or refounding, rediscovering. But retrieval is good because it's very active, and it's like, you're throwing out something that hasn't come back to you. But it's like almost like a Ford dog game in some ways. You can look at the Freudian, the child's game. Yeah. The Ford dog game is sort of like the retrieval here, right? And da comes back to you. None of the Dasein, the there of the game. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. All right. In the field where matter itself is deeply veiled, any investigation should avoid overestimating its results, for such inquiry is constantly forced to face the possibility of disclosing a still more original and a universal horizon from which you could draw the answer to the question, what does being mean? We can discuss such possibilities seriously and with a positive result only if the question, that's been asleep, of being is reawakened, and we have reached the point where we have come to terms with it in a controlled fashion. Very German. In a controlled fashion. We need to do this systematically.
Reckless.
Okay? So, he's going to move on here. This is looking at time. I'm not going to read all of this. Are there any questions about this section before I go on to the next one? This is the section 6, which is important, where he talks about the task of the destruction of the history of ontology. What is our task? What is the intention of this positive destruction of the history of things, right? Yeah. You can see historicity on page 19 means the constitution of being, of the occurrence of Dasein as such. Upon it, something like world history and belonging historically to world history is possible, right? So you're looking at the conditions for the possibility of history here. Making history. And, again, Marx thought we were, this is the way I read Marx, we're prehistorical. We have not yet entered into real history. Yeah, we have not begun to, first of all, liberate all the senses. We're not free of work. We're still living in this realm of necessity. Right? We're not even in the realm of freedom yet. So this is very important to keep in mind as, this kind of horizontal, very deep thinking that is going on, in these figures. Why I think, they're, listen, I don't know, but, just speculatively speaking, 200-300 years ahead of their time. Like they read Kant, in the early 20th century, they'll be in the 20th, if they still read, I doubt they're going to read, the machines will, go through this, but anyway, yeah, they would be reading this kind of thing and interpreting it, like we are,
But I guess.
Yeah, please.
I would wonder if those machines would have the.
They're not going to
have the ability to speak the way that he's talking about it here, because he defines Dasein, and that kind of brings up what Chris was asking before about the being of human beings. That's page 24, second bottom paragraph. He says in the ordinary and also philosophical definition of Dasein, that is, the being of human being is delineated as something in Greek, the creature whose being is essentially determined by its ability to speak.
Yes.
And it's interesting.
Chron logo ekon.
I was having difficulty, I was getting caught up in these trivial thing, which is like the being of being. Like that always is hard for me to grasp, the being of being. And I think for me at least, it's an English thing, because when I read it in like a different language where they have different words, so there's in Russian there's being, and there's the being of being. It doesn't mean the being of being; it means the being of beingness. but it's not really that. But it's, you know what I mean? Like there's a clear word that differentiates. It's the same in German, I think. So in English, it's very different.
The substantives in German are very, very much there. So you can speak in English, you sound like a jargon, the possibility of the possibility.
Exactly. But in Russian or German, it makes total sense.
It's a compounded.
So the language is limited philosophically. English is good for the stock market, man, but it's not good for philosophy.
Imperialism.
In German, sign versus sign.
Seinen versus sign. Yeah.
Not sign, Z-E-I-N-D.
Like when you have the end en versus without, it's that kind of a differentiation that English doesn't allow to have.
And the capitalization for the nouns also helps.
Yeah.
Whereas
so you can do a good parody on this. When I'm watching this stupid movie, I have friends over and we're watching it together. So we start doing a Mel Brooks on it. You know, we start doing a sign, you know, and the three Jewish women, I'm going to dance with Helene now, I'm going to dance with Anna, you know, and then we're going Zinin and, you know, etc. We started to do this kind of repetitious play.
The wife being in there. I don't know.
The wife was in there. Only photographs, never talked to.
Just the photograph.
I like the piece of work that said, you know, he was not chic, nor was he attractive, but he was a philosopher.
Oh, yeah.
The one that had all the work, you know, you could see with the shades, at the, you know, remember? Yeah. I don't know where. Yeah, please. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. I don't know if I can answer it, but yeah.
You probably already explained it.
No, I don't know. Yeah. What?
So it's page 19.
Yep.
It's the very beginning of the section 6.
Yes.
It says in a, sorry.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Right.
Whether so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sentences. It is in its practical being assigned always is how and what it always was.
Yes.
Whether explicitly or not, it is its past.
Right.
It is its own past, not only in such a way that its past, as it were, pushes itself along behind it.
Yes.
And that it possesses what is past as a property that is still objectively present.
Yes.
And at times has an effect on its design.
Mm-hmm.
Its past, in the manner of its being, which roughly expressed for each occasion occurs out of its future. Could you? I kind of understand, but I'm wondering if you could.
Well, I mean, you know, one way of doing this would be to say, you know, to talk about the future past.
Yeah.
Right? You basically have a plurality of the future exactly, but the past is always part of the determination, right? And what's past is part of you, right? Yeah, what has been past. So maybe one diagram.
Present tense, the past is part of us. It's not was past of us, but still is.
Yes, the past is always with you. So in the French, you have a category in language, the future, futur, antérieur, right?
Which is like an epistemology of Dasein, in a sense.
Yes, it could be referring to the knowledge of Dasein too. This does not negate the possibility of transformation. Because again, everything is being, you know, catapulted. This is the future ecstasies, right? These are the ecstasies. So you have, you know, in the past, certain kind of ecstasies or ecstatic temporalities where you may have been outstanding or you've stood outside of yourself, right? This remains a part of you. The present, the anwesend, you know, that he talks about, which is, you know, basically the ready to hand, the things, you know, ready to hand, is always working on a kind of almost linear line, right? The sequence of now points, etc. So the real movement is between being in the past, right, and being future oriented, right? So if you want to think of this more like a diagram of orientation, that is futurally oriented, right? But it is not, you know, radical break with the past, right? This may help you in this sense. So it's always futurally oriented. You cannot know this. It's very much like what Lacan says about anxiety and why you can get away with a short session. You know, you're good. Because you know the story, right? About short set. Well, anyway, I'm sorry, I'm crucified. Anyway, your anxiety is in the future. It's not about the past. that you have this going on in your past. It is that your anxiety is meeting you in your future. Yeah?
Coming from the future.
Coming from the future. Yeah. But meeting is good too. It is meaning you're encountering it, if you will, in the future.
Why?
That's
Because
the
we're
encounter.
moving.
Yeah.
Because we're moving towards
Yes,
the future, inevitably,
absolutely.
right?
Well, yes. Depending on what is the future.
Right.
You know.
But there will be future.
Yes, there will be the future.
Sort of like an inductive reasoning, based on what you've seen in the past, you can project an idea of what the future is.
No, I don't think it has a predictive mode in it.
I mean,
I think it's more about, experiential.
But to know,
go ahead.
But to know what's going to happen in
I mean,
the
it's
future.
inductive in the sense it's
exactly.
not deductive.
It's not. It's
right,
inductive.
right.
I said it poorly, but
right.
it was inductive.
Yeah. This is where it's meeting. So Lacan, to go back to the short session, and I don't think he's so off here, he says, I cut off in speech if it's 3 minutes into a session, because I think that's where the anxiety is the highest, that's what the patient has to encounter. So he came up with a short session. Right? You can charge the same as it was. This is why he was able to, house many Picassos and Courbet's Origin of the World and all this. But anyway, to put it in a context, if you really think about it, what do you really want to do in the psychoanalytic session is bring the patient to that moment where that encounter happens, and there's no one really there, on the other end of the couch, or somebody to grab you from the abyss, but that's your encounter, right? So in some ways, he's absolutely right, where this is the highest, where this, future is coming to meet you, or the encounter or the occurrence of the future is already there. He's right in the sense that this is where one's,
But he's saying here that the past occurs out of its future.
Yes.
Which is...
Well, it does, because the future is past. Think of the word revolution. We use the word revolution. Think about this in terms of language, right? Revolution is used in the scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution. It refers to a scientific revolution. We begin to use it in the political and the social sense not until 1789, really, in a way. We use the American historically, but the real revolution that shifted many things, basically, the American Revolution was a decolonizing revolution. It was not a revolution against, a whole system, or a bourgeois revolution in a certain way, right? Yeah, so against the tech. But anyway, all to say, we have different, things. So this is another thing that he's talking about the past. He's talking about historical time, right? Right. It is always already there. So again, the carefulness of the language
possibility
and possibility. Again, possibility is always higher than actuality. So if it's possible, if it's possible in the past, right? Again, I don't want you to see this as Hegelian circles that are spiraling up, and you close the dialectic in order to go to a higher level of synthesis. This is a very different type of reason, different type of logic, if you will. In the sense that it is. Like this. It's a kind of springing out into something, right? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I don't know who you were talking.
Sean. I don't either one of you. I saw Sean.
I was just listening to that. I was thinking about it a little bit differently from
the conversation
no problem. We were talking about earlier about time.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
But tell me how you're thinking about different. It's not the only thing about time, but it's related to this thing about the past is in it. The past is in the future. Right? So if I experience May of '68, and I say, I used to tell, I'm fully constituted by the events of May of '68. And one of my best friends, I'm completely negative constituted in May of '68. So we always have great polemics about things, right? In a sense. We're again catapulting into the future. The past is in us, different levels of the experience. So the revolution is always already there in the past, right? To be met through the future. It's really, if you want to write the narrative, future's past, right? In a sense. This is why this is why it's very stupid to talk about defeatism if you're pessimistic. Because there's no such thing as defeatism if you follow this kind of temporality. Because revolution is about time. It's not about, it's not only about redistributive of wealth and all these things are secondary to the time.
He seems like he's trying to juxtapose the idea that your past and your culture and your traditions make up the way that you see yourself and your future possibilities. But the other way, he's trying to posit it the other way around by saying that the way that you see yourself as going to die or as going to be able to achieve this is actually dictates.
This is both mentality, mortality. It's retrospective and prospective.
Because how you think of the future also reshapes how you thought of the past.
Right. I think that's what he's saying in this sentence. This is more.
Absolutely, it goes both ways. So I wouldn't say it's like that. I would say.
Well,
it's like
I'm not. I mean, it comes back around.
That's what got me caught. That's why I got.
This is where you're moving, though, right? I mean, you're always moving, and this is your situatedness. Is futures.
Right. Future oriented.
They're always oriented that way. That's why you say someone living in the design is always future. Orientation is always future.
And your
doesn't mean that the past has been overcome or suppressed. This is against the Hegelian dialectic that moves in terms of, where you repress, right? You retain and you lift to a higher plane. He's not doing this at all. This is not being repressed. This is already in the future.
No, I thought what he did here was wonderful.
But do you understand? He's
this.
Again arguing against the Hegelian circular reason as well as the spiraling dialectic unfolding, right, in space and time, or it unfolds in time as you move towards this process of absolute knowing. He is trying to talk about this as a futural new orientation after.
But he also uses it as a tool to show you that knowing may trip you up.
Of course. That's a good point.
Of this
like
dynamic right here, you have to be wary of it, of what's going on.
Right.
So what he's doing is he's pointing out how time can operate and how you can be operated on by time. So it's a watch out, because this first part is like, if we're going to do...
You're very dewy. I like that, though. It's good. No, you take the Germans like the best of the pragmatic traditions. I mean, the key word there is the operational, what you're talking about, how it operates on us.
Right.
That's a kind of,
But what is the movement like, though? If it wasn't the spiral, then so what is the movement in Heidegger?
See, for me, it's not about the movement, it's just being aware of this.
Well, it is a movement, though.
Right, but being aware of it, right?
Which means what?
But it's again retro, it's prospective, retrospective. Always at work in a certain way. So you're always in this protension, retention that I was talking about. You're perceiving the world, you're constituting the constitutive elements of the world, and at the same time you have this retentional memory of which you're bringing to the perception into the future. This is the Husserlian notion of consciousness. At a primary, at a very fundamental level.
Gives us then the ability to kind of step back for a second.
Yes, that's what we're doing.
Right, exactly.
That's what we're doing. The whole point of the Heideggerian enterprise, when you start using terms like Transcendental Phenomenology, is you are taking a step back to reflect on what has been, right? Or what is occurring.
I didn't mean it within time, I meant as how time is and how you are with time.
Well, we don't really know what is time yet. See, this is a question he's still posing.
Right.
We know we know that we interpret within the horizon of time, right? But we're interpreting again through Dasein.
Right, but I see this as an opportunity to see how to actually step back from what we think we know about time, to actually start to reconceptualize and be able to. Right.
Yes. Right. I mean, he wrote a piece called "Concepts of Time" too, another lecture.
Right.
So this has been his one thought. He said the great thinker has one thought. And his one thinking is the thought of being. Right? The one thought. I'm sorry. Right. Okay. Yeah, Chris. I'm sorry.
If Dasein
I got to settle down a little bit.
is being at hand, then doesn't Dasein?
No, Dasein is not only being at hand; it's also ready to hand, and it's ready towards towards the hand, ready to hand, present to hand. There are many levels to this. Also, speech. Idle talk.
Doesn't all of that imply that it's in the present?
No. No. No.
Why not?
No, why would it imply it's in the present?
If it's ready to hand.
No, there's also towards hand. You know, yeah. There's one that's present to hand, and then the tools that you talked about earlier today when you talked about techniques and the shaping of the hand. That doesn't necessarily mean you're in the present. It means that the hand may have been shaped by the past. You brought up a very good argument today with Family's class. Andre Leroy-Gourhan. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read him, but you had the, basically what he says about objects and technical objects and Simondon in another way. Yeah.
But to me, the Da and Dasein is about present. Is the present in
orientation? I want to use this word again. I mean, the presence of the presence. Maybe he is speaking about that. Maybe the Derridian critique is correct at that well, because you're presencing and absencing always, because that's again the absent past, the presencing of the future is a problem going forward. Just like as the absencing of the future and only the presencing of the past. And we're living through all kinds of regressions right now. Who's to say, I wanted to bring this up earlier today, that Reverend Barbara, we have a new Poor People's March? I thought we had one 50 years ago. Why are we going back to these kind of strategies, right, in terms of political strategies? We know, right? Why are we doing this, in a sense? Do we learn from time? Do we learn, a new kind of politics, a new way? I'm not knocking. I mean, I'll probably march too if it was the right kind of demonstration. But it again shows the imagination is not really working, in a sense, because it's a kind of recycled, thing. It's nothing that's breaking through to a kind of new radicality or something like that. Recycled. Positions. Yeah, go ahead.
Would you say that his idea of destruction of tradition, which is part of his positive destruction, is positively affecting the future? He's trying to reshape the past.
But again, you can look at this kind of thing that he's speaking to, that you brought attention to, that we've brought attention to here, is that this being in the past is partially of working through the tradition. Right? We're not going to escape Aristotle's fourth book. You go back and read the fourth book of physics. There's still all kinds of interesting stuff in there, that we still use, in a way. When you think about double bind theory, the original double bind is the sacrifice of a family member for the good of the state. This goes on in daily politics all the time, but this is already it's Abraham in terms of the family son member, and then it's the daughter in Agamemnon, the Greek world and the Jewish world, the Judaic Greco world, if you want to talk about Athens or, Jerusalem or Athens, has these kind of models under which we think, under the horizon we think. So the question, to me again, is he's really trying to work through, once again, let me see if this clears up a little bit. He's trying to think through, if you will, and destroy this kind of Judeo-Christian, incorporation of the Logos as word, right? Also, the misreading, what he considers a massive misreading of ontology by the scholastics that lead up to, the Cartesian domination of the domination by the subject over the object, to the Kantian categories. He's trying to do all this, right, by rethinking what truth really is, what has been concealed in the tradition. Very much like Derrida, who speaks about the censorship of the writing subject or the trace, and what happens on the margins and who this cuts out. Heidegger is really talking about, we have a question of forgetting here, which has basically censored out things that have made us, into this nihilistic civilization based on Judeo-Christian codes, morality. And we see this play out in everyday life. I mean, I'm not, look, I can't stand perverse like Weinstein and Toback and all this, but this is dominant news at this point. Why are we getting there? What is this moral register that it's to what? What is this really a fear of, that this becomes so much news? I know it's commodification. I know all those reasons. But what drive and what libidinal economy does this play to in how we're constituted? This is important. Or, you know, Melania Trump, or Donald Trump for that matter, where you have the circus without the bread, without any delivery, how this is going to go on. And I'd be willing to bet right now, I'll change the bet maybe next year, that he gets reelected in 2020 if he decides to run. I may be wrong, but, you know.
Yeah. Things continue, yeah.
The
market keeps going up. Yeah.
I think the way that he wrote it here that helped me understand this. The way that he phrased it that helped me understand it was our entanglement in tradition deprives Dasein of leadership in questioning and understanding. That was kind of like simply put.
Look. This whole thing about futural, you know, in a way, is to disentangle the past. Learning is really unlearning. You know, really, education is ultimately undoing the damage that has happened. We are really unlearning a whole, you know, set of learning categories. This is what he's really going towards, if you want to think of this as a pedagogical enterprise. You know,
but you being able to have your leadership in your own questioning and understanding, which is ontology for him, I guess. It is.
Well, I don't know if it comes back just to you. You see, again, he's trying to look at this as an active movement in history. Mm-hmm. It is the history of being. You know, when I put up these epochs, he's looking now, you know, you can read and you go back and you say, okay, as a reading strategy and an interpretive strategy, go back and take a look at Descartes' discourse on the method, right? What does this method really want to do? And he refers to it a little bit. Wants to find clarity, distinctiveness, self-evidence, right? Reducing complex problems into parts so they can be solved better, give us order of reasons, and be comprehensive in all endeavors so we leave nothing out. And this is all in a drive to certainty, of which we're going to build the foundation for the scientific project. And this is still dominant, this Cartesian method. Then the Kantian comes along with another kind of little bit of the method. You know, we have the deductive transcendental deduction, formation of how do we form categories, tables of categories. How do we schematize? We're always figuring something. Schema in Greek means to figure. How do we begin to show this at work? So Heidegger, you know, and then Hegel, who wants to put everything into the full proof. Hegel becomes the Parmenides of German idealism, if you will, the highest stage of German philosophy, classical philosophy. That, you know, he's going to bring everything together into absolute knowing subject, right? And that the world historical spirit, you know, will play out before our eyes under the guise of the cunning of reason. You know, these are the phrases he uses, you know, ultimately. So for Heidegger, this is, again, the product and the symptom, even better put, probably, the symptom of Western metaphysics, you know, since Plato and Aristotle. This is where it leads. And it leads to what Nietzsche says, nihilism, right? And this is still embedded within, quote unquote, the Judeo-Christian reading of ancient Greek philosophy that put it on a different path, right? That ended up, you know, and these are all very smart people. Aquinas, Duns Scotus, you know, what's his name, the one I used to like, Peter of Spain. Yeah, right, they had great names, Peter of Spain. Great logician in the 12th century. Yeah, you'll see Count Yorick later in here. Count Yorick is one of his other people. So you have all this cast of characters, right, that are redoing the history of philosophy, right, to fit a certain social, you know, you can do a Marxian analysis, obviously. The same Thomas Aquinas is the highest stage of the Catholic Church. The Summa Theological, you know, brings together all the elements. It kind of predates the Ignatius Loyola and the formation of the Jesuits. You can do all these kind of historical narratives around this and also look at social and historical formation. But for Heidegger, that again is a secondary phenomenon. I'm not saying I agree with this totally, but that it's being playing out in the world, right? The being at play, right? And I'm going to talk about this as hermeneutics. I think it's probably a good time. That this is, you know, the epoch of self-consciousness that has gotten us out of the Middle Ages. It's not just capitalism. It's not just, to quote the Copernican turn in science, but it really becomes the discourse of self-consciousness, our epoch. And this is where we are. So now we're at an impasse because we ask the question, do we really have a self anymore? Is there really a subject? right? Where are we on this borderline now going forward? What is consciousness, right? If information, artificial technology, information technology, and artificial intelligence can do almost everything that's necessary for the functioning of the system, right? Yeah, I mean the Amazon, warehouses. Can the robots, fulfill all the orders? How many jobs will be eliminated? These are all ontic modifications for him that have existential, derivative problems, issues attached to it.
So one thing that could happen is probably the modification of the concept of being by introducing elements from artificial intelligence. That would be the positivist next move.
Yes, well, that's what the positives are doing. You have this in the movies all the time. You have the movies. You have the nice machine. Right?
But the left should engage with that also.
Yes, of course.
The reincorporation of AI into
your ontic levels today. If you want reading in this, I mean, Mackenzie Ward. You have people like Alexander Galloway who writes. I know he's not great, but he does a thing on protocol. Protocol is about ontic modifications, right? In a sense, it's not on any kind of level like this. It's not an ontology. But again, Heidegger is saying this is where we are. This is where, and for him, seeing the dominance of the cybernetic, moment, right? Which is obviously where we are, the human use of human beings. You can read Wiener's classic Beats, should be read, You have to remember, these people were all part of the Social Science Research Council after World War II, and they helped develop policy in the United States. You have Norman Wiener was part of this group. I think Bateson was peripheral, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, husband of Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, the author of the double bind theory. You had Lawrence Kuby, the psychoanalyst, in terms of, all these people became, how do you frame the social sciences for the future, right? For the, et cetera. So this is all on the level that Heidegger is talking about, regional, but also part of the cybernetic space and cybernetic attempt to dominate and control. And that's where we are. Why you go FANG economy? I mean, really in a way. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix and Google, right? You have all the Cartesian elements there completely, right? You have Hegelian absolute knowing in Google. You have, Netflix, the extended thing, the visuals, right? You have everything. Mode of distribution, Amazon. Mode, et cetera. Yeah. Apple and the what do they call their factories? Where they make this thing, Foxconn. Yeah. All these things, new modes of production, building motherboards, building this kind of stuff. Yeah. So
we'll be able to use the word baying, B-A-I-N.
Yeah, of course. That's coming. In a
trademark that.
Trademark.
Said it first.
Yeah.
You did? Okay, Rachel. Yeah. As long as you invite us to Jamaica. Yeah.
I didn't say it.
Okay. Well, Arto will invite us to Bulgaria. We go Sofia and Jamaica. Yeah. Anyway, but I mean, I don't know. This is a good discussion because I think it clarifies, a lot about the.
Yeah. The only other question I had about self-consciousness, because you just mentioned it, was would you think that the word self-awareness would be more appropriate for something that...
Well, this is again German, Bewusstsein is the term. So it's consciousness.
But it's consciousness really is the part that he has the problem with. Because he says in its being, Dasein is concerned about its very being and understands itself in some way. That's one of his main definitions. And that sounds like self-consciousness in the sort of typical sense, but obviously it's consciousness that he's objecting to.
Yeah. Anyway, he's not objecting to consciousness, but he specifies this is the epoch under which we have been thrown.
Right.
For him, the thrownness is also working in history, right? Yeah. It's double S. I'm sorry. It's double S. The Wittgenstein. Anyway. The problem is this is part of what he would call a historical sending. He plays upon Schicksal, right, and Geschichte in German, history and the sending, right? So these epochs that are, the history of being, are turning on the sending. So this has been sent to us by the Cartesian moment, the scientific revolution, because what Descartes is trying to do is, again, lay the foundation for, the new scientific rationality that develops in the 17th century. We are no longer the center of the universe, right? We are no longer geocentric. We're in a heliocentric universe. Now we're no longer in a heliocentric universe in a lot of ways, right? Even though we still operate within these parameters mostly. Now we're living in, glacial, glacial decenterings in some ways. But to think this through is what he's trying to do. Again, it's not a question of whether he's going to use. This is the thrownness of the period. This is philosophical modernity. This is capitalism. This is mercantile capitalism. Double entry bookkeeping is taking place. The Treviso arithmetic. All this stuff is going on at the ontic level. If you're going to write history this way, right? The double entry bookkeeping. The Treviso arithmetic in Treviso, Italy, which was changing from the abacus to new multiplication tables that merchants started to use, right, during this period. The discovery of the Americas, the colonization of the Americas, the colonization of the West Indies, the beginning of the East India Company. All of these things for Heidegger are all, yes, it's not turning his back on it. But again, it's part of the ontic modification of a kind of sending, if you will, because of the metaphysical tradition, right? This is about principles that are being thrown, right? In a sense, yeah, principles, yeah. What commands, what leads, and to what do we obey, and what leads during this during a particular epoch, yeah. So this is why he's trying to destroy, and why this moment of destruction of metaphysics to work through from Heidegger to Derrida, right, is happening, because they understand that unless we, take this off the beaten track into something else, whether it's wood paths, whether it's the writing machine and, overcoming it, liberating signifiers, etc., we don't have a quote, to use William Burroughs' famous phrase, a ghost of a chance, right? In some ways, right? And again, this whole thing about the future, in a way, the hand that throws the dice is just as important as how the dice fall, right? If you want to think of it this way in terms of a movement.
The throw of the dice will never obliterate chance.
Very good. And you know who said that? The great poet. Yes, indeed. And a great film by Chantal Ackerman.
Really?
Yes. They're sitting in a circle chanting it.
What's it called? What's the movie?
Every revolution is the throw of the die. And actually, it's remade by Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Levy, these German filmmakers. Every revolution is the throw of the die. Yeah. Okay, let me do this quickly on the hermeneutics. I want to make sure we. I think one way of thinking of this whole thing, image-wise, is the vote.
I don't think it would have that bottom, revolution back. It would be more like the bow would be like you're saying, a projection,
right?
Like a retention.
And it would come back,
right? Because that they would be happening more within this.
Right, always is happening.
It's always already there, rather than having to go back to it.
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it.
Because it is, that's how it's operating.
Okay.
Yeah. Right?
Sure.
It's not really a throne, it's because it's in the moment, these two things are happening.
Always two things.
Right?
Yeah. Yes.
The graph makes you feel like we're going.
Oh, you mean you feel like you're rising up towards something. Okay, fair enough.
Now, so
I'm trying to do this through the outstanding that you're projected outward, or outstanding. But yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. In the moment.
Yeah. The work of death is in the bow. Right? This is Heraclitus. The work of death is in the bow. In the pulling.
On all these, but also all these other levels, because the bow can't cause But
of course.
But not the fork. Oh,
right.
I mean the fork thing too.
Yeah, right. Okay, let me do this. Hermeneutics goes back to the Greeks, as I mentioned. It's by the divinity Hermes. You know, is kind of who was an old divinity who became the messenger of the gods. You know, he was basically a cattle thief. You know, materially speaking. So he went from place to place and said, "There's a lot of cattle over here. You can steal here," and etc. But anyway, that's another. And also, as I mentioned to you, this was a code on stealth technology, which Norman O'Brien wrote his thesis, Hermes the Thief, on this early. Very, very interesting because he worked in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, during the war, and this was a code on stealth technology. Was used. So Hermes has like the Apollo mission to the heavens. You know, they used a lot of these Greek names. You know,
I think the French nuclear missile is called Hermes too.
Is it Hermes too? And the bag too.
For some, I just read about that.
Right? Yeah, scarves and all expensive. Expensive that thief. That Greek.
The Russian missiles carry the names of knives.
All right. So in Greek, hermenein, the verb, to really means multiple things. Okay, so one, I'm going to give you many things. To explain or to explicate. To make something explicit, right? And, I mean, in better put, to make a complex matter understandable. I'll try to write this as clearly as I can. I hate these things, but anyway. All right, another one is to utter. Here's where speech comes in. And the utterance, as Bakhtin speaks about it, if any of you have read Marxism and the Philosophy of Language, is very much in this tradition. Speaking what is in one's mind. Okay? So you have explanation, explication, and utterance. To speak what is in one's mind. Okay. Then to represent. And this is making visible a hidden meaning. And in a way, this is where play comes in, playing. So you have understand, playing, and speaking, all in the verse 3. Fourthly, to carry over. And this is basically translation. Also, for those of you who don't know this, metaphorian means to transport, which is the word metaphor, comes from metaphorian. The verb is to transport. This is to translate, to carry over, to bring from one language to another. So you have playing and then translating. So this becomes another discourse to appropriate. And this is interpreting, or to make. Some meaning one's own. And then, so this is interpreting. And then to announce. Make something publicly known. This is, I think, best thought of as heralding, as Jameson would have it, the herald of something to come. This is being used in literary theory often. And then so to announce. And then finally, 7 is to send over. I'm going to just put the dispatch, okay? Dispatch a message. Yeah, dispatch a message. And this would be transmission. Or transmitting. Right? So you have explicating or speaking, or teaching, really in a way here. to make a matter understandable, a complex matter. Teaching, then to speak with what is in one's mind, speaking. This is the legen that he speaks about. Then also to play, to make visible a hidden meaning, is basically what playfulness and playing means for in the hermeneutic tradition. To carry over, to translate, right? To appropriate, to make some meaning, which is how we interpret. To give it some meaning, we have to interpret it. And what does it mean to Dasein, as the interrogator, as the, as well as, being with, in terms of a dialogue. To announce, that's basically to herald something. It's about ready to come, etc. And then, and that comes out of the Delphic Oracle, of course. There are many historical sites for this. The other one is, of course, transmitting, dispatching a message, like Hermes would do. Well, Stavros has got 50 cattle, he only needs 10, you can steal 40. Then he goes to Demetrius and he says, you're 25 cattle over in, in Yanis's, farm, etc. He dispatches messages, etc. Right? Okay, so this is going on. So the question here is, then you go to the Delphic Oracle, and you see this in the tragedies, right? With Pythia, you go to Pythia to get translations of Delphi. So divine language is put into human language because Apollo is speaking through her, and this is the reason Socrates supposedly is killed, right? That he represents the new divinity, Apollo, or the art of hermeneutics, into the system, right? So this actually plays actively with Plato's doctrine of the truth, that the hermeneutic moment at the Delphic Oracle, or the allegiance to the Delphic Oracle in wisdom, is somehow, it's a new read, it's a kind of reading, of this, and the entire Oedipus trilogy, the role of Tiresias, the soothsayer, one of the great interpreters, one of the great characters in ancient Greek drama, the blind soothsayer that's in all the, Sophoclean tragedies, right? Yeah, what were you going to say? Yeah.
He's put in one of these incredible dilemmas where he has to choose. The reason he was blinded, he has to choose. I guess Zeus and Hera were having an argument about whether men or women had greater satisfaction in orgasm.
Yes, that's right. Tiresias had both.
Yeah,
and he said women had a better go of it. He said women had a better go.
He said women, and for that reason he was blinded.
Yes, so Zeus didn't like that answer.
No, Zeus didn't like it. But then Hera gave him...
The god of thunder.
Right, Hera gave him the gift of insight. So, so Hera then gave him as a compensation.
Yes, gave him compensation by giving him blindness and insight is where we get the whole thing from. Paul Demon. There you go. See? So anyway, right. Okay, yeah, please, yeah, go ahead.
I'm still not sure why Socrates was killed, though. What does that have to do with Hermes?
He claimed the allegiance to the divinity Apollo, which was a new god, not to Zeus, in terms of the tyrants. So so in a way, they did not like this introduction of the Apollo at the Delphic Oracle, who said Socrates is the wisest of men, right? And you know how he tests the wisdom, right? He goes around to 3 different characters. First, he goes to the statesman. Talks to the statesman, arrogant, telling him how great he is. Socrates takes a step back and says, "This guy's really ignorant." He says, "At least," this is where he gets Socratic ignorance, "at least I'm aware of my ignorance, but he isn't aware of his ignorance, and therefore, deductively, I'm more wiser than he is, because at least I'm aware of how ignorant I am." Then he does the same thing with the poet. The poet tells him how great he is in his poems, but the poet doesn't know how the poem is really made, or the theory behind the poem. How can this guy be wise? Same thing. Another thing about ignorance. And then finally he goes to the craftsperson, who can make things, but can't tell you how it's made, or what it's made for. So this is what he gets, gets pegged on, right? Going around, and then he says, well, I concluded through this, since I'm aware of my own ignorance, I'm wiser than all these other people, because they're deluded in terms of their self-importance and their self-knowledge, etc., that they're really wise. So this set off a chain. Of course, this is in the Apology, which again, we talk about Christian apology, making excuses. The real meaning of the apology in Greek is to give a self-defense, and the apologia, really in a way, is to give account of where one is. Again, this whole diagram, I'm using Heidegger obviously strongly, but that the original apology was to say where one was, to give an account of the other. Yes, absolutely.
The defense, and then Shelley called it a defense of poetry.
Yes, exactly.
But apology means a defense.
And you took this from the English Romantics to the German Romantics, but in between everybody else is the apology as confessional. It's interesting how this division happens, because what do the English and the Germans Romantics do? They go back to the Greeks, right? It's interesting. They don't go.
Only Shelley knew the Greek.
He did. So did Keats. And Lord Byron spent half his time there, chasing around the Parthenon. Right. Right. All right. So these are different definitions of the use of hermeneutics. So when you see this being used, and a hermeneut is someone who practices this. This is what a hermeneut became, right? And in some ways, the Delphic Oracle, you could do an essay. This is, kind of a, outside creativity, but you could do an article about Heidegger and, trying to bust the Delphic Oracle, who mumbles, right? Who speaks in riddles, right? Much like the Sphinx, much like so in a way, this whole question of the forgetting of being, right, becomes a new way of interpreting the question of being and why we've forgotten. It's not so much only that we're going to look for the meaning or repose the question, it's the question, why do we forget it? That's part of the past and the positive destruction. Why the hell did we forget it? What were why did that happen? How did we get into this?
Doesn't sound like he says, he's saying that these Greeks, especially Aristotle, they had the question right, but they didn't quite they missed a couple things, they didn't quite get it right, they set us on the wrong foot, but they were asking the right question.
That's correct.
So it doesn't sound like he's claiming that anybody really ever had it.
Right. So
until him,
yeah,
but he didn't claim to get it either, right? He said that.
He never said he figured it. No, he never found being. Yeah, yeah.
At least he knows his own ignorance.
At least he knows the question.
Of course,
he stated the question.
He would. That's exactly how he would reply, probably, or with silence.
Problematized it.
He was good at the silence.
It's very ominous. It's much more ominous.
Very, very, very silent. In the hut.
I have nothing to say.
In the hut, right?
But his villa is not that bad. Did you see pictures of his little villa? It's like a little two-story.
Oh, he built it himself. Oh, yeah, of course.
Was a hut?
Yeah, the hut.
It's like a villa, like two-story.
That's where he came up with the hammering metaphor.
The broken hammer.
He was broken.
That's what we are. We're the broken hammer. You cannot know the hammer until it's broken. This is really what he's talking about. Is this kind of fragmentation, this abyssal plane on which we're working. This is all, again, a byproduct, if you will, or symptoms of the forgetting of the question. To Heidegger's mind, it may be different for other people. For Marx, it may be alienated labor. There's no meaning, in terms of labor-capital relations, except profit and extraction of surplus. And being is only value in this case. In Nietzsche, that being is only about the trajectory of power, the will to power, So for him,
but he would call those all theories. I don't think theories.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think in some ways Heidegger becomes ambiguous, and you have to read closely that you can make a case when he does the Nietzsche meditation, which are 4 long years and very, very exacting. And I still think it's the strongest meditation out there, on Nietzsche. That the will to power becomes incredibly, active as maybe a new, epoch. new epoch of being.
I don't want to derail this. But
yeah, that's okay. We're already derailed, so don't worry about that.
After the turn, from what I've read, that's part of it, is that he decides that Dasein has epics and has epicness, and it's sort of, there are different...
Well, he starts to write the history of being, whereas here, he's just talking about the question, the meaning, and, retrieval. This is about retrieval, recapitulation, and repetition, whereas later, it's about how do I look at the condition for the possibility of the history of being, right?
Well, this has more of a universal tone to it.
Yeah, or, he's going to write, like any philosopher, Hegel will write a philosophy of history, where he goes through, stages, the Oriental, he speaks of the Africans, he speaks of the West, etc. He speaks of the, etc. Not favorably in a lot of cases. There's just another thing about Hegel and race that came up. But anyway, all to say, again, he's going to, try to say, okay, I'm going to do a history here because he's talking about under the horizon of time, and doesn't history, take place within time? Yeah. So he has to do this. He's looking for the conditions of the possibility of that history, where he's not relegated just to historicism, reading the now points, or what you brought up earlier today, which I'm sorry this time, I was going to say something, but I don't want to, we were kind of crazy in the first session for a little while there, nobody really understanding the text. But when you brought up immanence, immanence is a category of historicism, that somehow you can be immanent to the age you're in, and you write it, right?
I didn't bring it up. Stanley brought it up.
Oh, okay.
You
answered. Okay, and then that the immanence, right, is counterpoint dialectically is in a relationship with transcendence.
That's what
so that the transcendence is always in this double movement with immanence, where the concepts. In philosophy, Spinoza may only write during the period of the 17th century and is bound by certain forms and maybe even certain topics, but they're concepts that kind of live outside of that time. They become transcendent, right, in some ways. And this is where he's going to. He's going to talk about transcendence, which is a major category, the transcendent in medieval times, and then comes up in Kant, the transcendental illusion, the transcendental ego. We went through the transcendental illusion yesterday. You remember we were talking about necessary fiction. Do we need these necessary fictions, these necessary illusions to keep us by? This is what hope is. This is why your friend Camus, last thing to come out of Pandora's box. It's a necessary, illusion that we need to have. So Kant's dealing with this, and he's trying to take the transcendental and bring this down to the Dasein again. It's a grounding phenomenon. Back to us in everyday life. He's going to go. We haven't gotten there yet, but he's going to really speak from the position, a la Henri Lefebvre, who's later, right, of the position of Dasein in everyday life. This is what subjectivity does. We begin with ourselves, with the things themselves, how we constitute the things. This is where we're going to begin. And it's only through us that we can begin to try to have access. Right? Whether we get it or not is another question. Right? So, okay, let me just do a couple of other things before we go today, and then we'll pick up with this. I think we can get through next time. I do wanted to give you the hermeneutics, and I'll speak more about this because he's going to engage hermeneutics often, and I think explaining, explicating, uttering. You're seeing hermeneutics on multiple levels, and we're going to see how this works out to make visible the hidden meaning, to make manifest, to represent, to translate, to appropriate, announce, dispatch. All these things are part of the hermeneutical enterprise. And there are three basic methods that are operative in the human sciences today. Dialectics, both in the Marxian sense and in the Hegelian sense, and in the old Greek sense of Plato's dialectics, etc. There's the positivist model, in which the agglomeration of facts, using the facts for one's purposes, in order to build. There are four actually. The genealogical, which Nietzsche is going to do, where you go through the background of a concept or how, you know, something came to be when he uses 3 moments of history. For Nietzsche, the 3 moments of history are the antiquarian, which could be the ancient ontology here, the monumental, what has been built to that, and how do you read that through systems of monuments, etc., and then the critical, which is the modern, which is an alacrity of being able to move either way, you know, and doing genealogies. You know, Nietzsche did the genealogy of morals, right? He wants to look at the moral codes and customs we live by and how our mores are shaped, etc. And then finally the hermeneutical, you know. So Fred Jameson, for those of you that know the political unconscious, is basically a hermeneutical enterprise. It's a hermeneutical hyphen dialectical enterprise. You read the sections on how to read St. Augustine and do a hermeneutical study, you'll get a good example of how Heidegger and Marx meet, you know, in terms of hermeneutical dialectical approaches to things. So, I mean, we've been, I think, for the first, you know, 3 weeks, 4 weeks of this class, both looking at historical, you know, effects of Heidegger, how he got to this. We've been concentrating mostly on method. It's important because method is the phenomenology, and he'll speak to this. Let me just, I won't go back to the text. I'll just give you a couple of things here. That philosophy, page 36, kind of at the end of this, is universal phenomenological ontology. This is in the last section. Let's see where it is exactly.
Right before section 8.
Yeah, right before section 8. Yeah. So he says, this is interesting. Ontology and phenomenology are not 2 different disciplines, which among others belong to philosophy. Both terms characterize philosophy itself. Object and procedure. Both its object and its procedure. Moving. Philosophy, and this is important, is universal phenomenological ontology, taking its departure from the hermeneutic of Dasein, explaining, explicating, uttering, representing, carrying over, appropriating, announcing, and dispatching, right? Right? Which, as an analysis of existence, right, has fastened the end of guideline of all philosophical inquiry to the point from which it arises and to which it returns. So the emergence, as well as what it returns, and going back to the temporality, your very good point about both of you, Sam and Sean, about the past, right? The past is already in the future, right? Already in. And, you know, and again, the work of the bow, always already operative. The following investigations, you know, and he mentions Husserl about logical investigation, our elucidation of the preliminary concept of phenomenology show that it is essential. Character does not consist as in its actuality as a philosophical movement. Higher than actuality stands possibility. We can understand phenomenology only or solely by seizing upon it as a possibility. Only as a possibility. Seize upon it. With regard to the awkwardness and inelegance of the expression and following now, so he's saying, you know, I'm not inelegant here. Yeah. You know, my dear committee, I need a job, you know. We may remark that it is one thing to report narratively, and I spoke about this, you know, 2 weeks ago, about beings, and another to grasp beings in their being, right? For the latter task, not only are most of the words lacking, but above all, the grammar, in quotes. If we may allude to earlier and in their own right altogether incomparable researches on the analysis of being, then we should compare the ontological sections in Plato's Parmenides, which is a dialogue. It's not the poem of Parmenides, the treatise on logical contradiction. It's the dialogue of Parmenides. Or the 4th chapter of the 7th book of Aristotle's Metaphysics, with a narrative passage from Thucydides. So he's really in this game. I'm going to put 3 books in front of you, and we're going to see the ontological, Aristotle's Metaphysics, Plato's Parmenides, the narrative reportage, and this is one of Marx's favorite books, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars. He loved this history, but for Heidegger, it's still narrative, right? And not, you know, We must eliminate the storytellers and bring in the hermeneutics and the Dasein, so to speak. Then we can see the stunning character of the formulations with which their philosophers challenged the Greeks. Since our powers are essentially inferior, and also since the area of being to be disclosed ontologically is far more difficult than presented to the Greeks, the complexity of our concept formation and the severity of our expression will increase. German all the way.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, again, he's going to make this this thing. Yeah. And again, it's this interior dialogue. Pretty clear what the story is here. It's going to be this interior dialogue with the ancient Greek that's going to rewrite the ontology from the position of a new temporality, a horizon of time into the future, right? But again, retrieving this past, right, through a negative and phenomenological destruction of it, right? So you're always in this kind of dual movement, destruction, construction. Why I wanted to begin with a method. Did you get a copy of the basic problem? I think I sent it to you, right? The basic problems of phenomenology? No, I was asking Sean. Yeah, a little handout, about 15 pages. We want some of it here, right? Okay, good. Yeah. So anyway, so you're going back to this phenomenological destruction, right? Positive destruction, construction, right? And at the same time, you're going through these hermeneutical moments of from explanation all the way to dispatching, right? So all the problems of us right here. How do you explain? How do you teach? How do you explicate complex matter? How do you make it understandable? How do you speak one's mind? What is your utterance about? You know, you can see where this will lead. We'll see this more at work when we get into the section on language. How do you represent, something? Well, how do you play, right? Carry it over. How do you appropriate, announce, and dispatch? And from what I understand from people that have read him, carefully in the German, there's a very playful amount of German puns and turns of phrases in the work. It reads.
While, if you have the minute, while we're on this page still, I had a question about the paragraph right before that, with being is the transcendence, pure and simple.
Yes.
And specifically about his footnote to that, with this at the asterisk. Could we this is page 36 still, at the top where he says in italics, being is the transcendence, pure and simple.
Well, the transcendence would be the future.
Well, then, okay, so then the asterisk in his footnote is, of course, not transcendence, despite every metaphysical resonance, scholastic and Greek.
But it's ecstatic temporality.
Yeah, rather than transcendence as the ecstatic temporality.
Temporality. It becomes a horizon. To see the horizon presupposes this future ecstasies. You're not really seeing only the horizon of the past. You want to think of this like an old...
The horizon of the future.
Yes, right, exactly.
But it's interesting how
who will come on the horizon? As Deleuze and Guattari used to say about an anti-Oedipus and their research with the schizophrenics and a lot of people in the asylum. Who will appear to their mind? Is it the Black Panther with a machine gun? Is it Mao on the Great March? This is an example of ecstatic temporality on the horizon when they presuppose that all desire in its essence is revolutionary.
Or Google.
This is what it is. They have a metaphysical presupposition. Deleuze and Well, that's the reactionary ecstasies. Right. The new platforms. Platform is the key word. I heard that word 10 times today when we had this meeting on school. The Rick Wolf people. Yeah.
But he does say, however, transcendence from the truth of being the event.
Yes, the event is the moment. I mean, to give you the German word is Ereignis. It's the moment of appropriation. When you say appropriate, number 5 here, to make some meaning, the event always has meaning. So for the appropriation for Alain Badiou, the 4 events that constitute our future, right, are 1789, the French Revolution, 1871, the Paris Commune, November 7th, coming up soon, 1917, it'll be the 100th anniversary on our calendar of the Bolshevik Revolution, and May of 1968. He puts that in that. So these are events of appropriation where the event itself is Ereignis, and Ereignis also means to not only appropriate, but to make one's own, right? Stronger put, to make one's own. And this is where he goes later in terms of the reversal. It's no longer being as time, but time as being, where he says time is the event of appropriation. He begins to talk about that too. Yeah, right? Okay? So his master, and maybe I should finish here. I mean, you know, I know this is very dense, and we shouldn't go 3.5, 4 hours. But anyway, his master Husserl is really looking at these originary moments of where geometry is founded, the modern geometry, the origin of geometry, right? Or the origin of arithmetic. He's trying to get to these moments in which the actual event took place. So he's taking this from his master in terms of the phenomenological method, you know, where you basically suspend your natural attitude. You look at an object with naivete, right? Almost like the mind of a child, but at the same time, you have the ability to reflect and constitute what you're, you know, and reflect upon what you're constituting and get back to that moment, that event of appropriation. How did this happen? Under what conditions happened? So Husserl builds a whole phenomenological method around this. This is what the transcendental reduction does. You know, this is what the eidetic reduction is. You're there to see the idea, how the idea was generated.
It's important.
So I'm just going to say, just before you go on, just let me just say one thing. So instead of teaching mathematics by formulas, you would teach mathematics by concepts in the schools. Okay? So that's one practical usage of this. But go ahead, I'm listening.
No. I was just thinking that when you were talking about it, I was like, that's a very good tool to use as you're trying to uncover being and Dasein.
Yes.
Right.
This is the phenomenological, but he's going to call it the hermeneutical phenomenology.
It's not the ontological approach, it's the ontological approach.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Yes, of course.
So, but it's just an example.
Yes, right.
Because he's done a lot through the text, setting up these examples just so that we could follow along.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, any other questions before we? I mean, because I think maybe what we could do is carefully. I mean, I think this is important next time to start with let me just see here. The section on what the concept of phenomena is, right? Number 7, section 7, pages 26 all the way through 35, huh? Yeah. You want me to do it today?
No.
Yes.
I can wait.
You sure? You sure?
I can sublimate.
Okay, you can sublimate. Okay, I like that. That's good. I heard that.
There's no cup of coffee even.
Yeah, no even cup of coffee. Right. Anyway, all right. So anyway, let's do 26 through 36 very carefully. Next time, 26 through 36 carefully, and let's go on. Like I said, the preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein, all the way up to chapter 2, to page 51. We should be able to get through that, and I'll, again, stick to the text. But you need this kind of, I think, what a verb hermeneuin means to interpret what hermeneutics really is. And these are 7 good pointers, right? And also a history of how hermeneutics came to be. And so today, you talk. They're hermeneutes, they're deconstructionists, they're dialecticians, and they're genealogists, and they're positivists. These are your 5 basic groups of methodologies that are all working with it. Positivism's horrible with mathematics and sciences, even though that's what it's based upon, as we see it going forward, right? Dialectics sometimes may fail us, right? Because it somehow becomes closed upon itself. We can talk more about that as we go forward. Mm-hmm. Genealogy is very good when you look at concept formation, but it doesn't ultimately give us movement, right? So we have to, try to think about the limitations of these methods that we have at our disposal. What's in our arsenal, as we say. It's always good to use the weapons of criticism with the criticism of weapons, or as Deleuze says, in Annie DeFranco, I'm always looking for a weapon, a new critical weapons wherever I go. So, yeah. So that makes sense. Okay, good. So you're